Ladies and gentlemen, when I was a young man, I believed shouting made you strong. Now I know. It just makes you heard. That's a very different thing. The recent Iran-Israel war has made the world hold its breath. Missiles fly, oil price shake, alliances test their limits. And then, people look around and ask, where is China? Why did the dragon back off when it mattered most? Well, let me tell you something sometimes. The most powerful move is not moving at all. 1. Timing is everything. But so is silence in life. You don't win by arriving at every fight. You win by showing up when it matters to your goals. China didn't jump in. Not because it's weak, but because it knows something. Noise is not strategy. Western media shouting, China stayed silent. I say, maybe it was listening. 2. China plays Go, not chess. The West plays chess. Sacrifice a piece, take a piece. Quick, sharp. China plays Go. The game of patience. It spreads influence like ink on paper. Slowly, quietly, endlessly. And in Go, you don't win by attacking every piece. You win by controlling the board. So while bombs exploded in the Middle East, China calculating, what do I gain? What do I lose? And where will the world be when the dust settles? 3. Economics decides more wars than weapons. Wars end. Markets last. China's trade with both Israel and Iran runs into the billions. It doesn't sell missiles. It sells roads, railways, AI, and solar panels. It knows the winner of this war will need reconstruction, energy, investment, not more soldiers. So backing off. It wasn't weakness, it was future thinking. 4. Don't bet the factory on a neighbor's fire. If your neighbor's house is burning, would you run in wearing your best suit? That's what military intervention is: expensive, dirty, and dangerous. China's economy is under pressure, slowing growth, property crisis, youth unemployment. Jumping into a Middle East firestorm would be like pouring oil on your own kitchen floor. It stepped back to protect its own house first. 5. Global markets hate loud friends today. Friends are not just countries. They're investors, consumer supply chains, and the world. It doesn't want more fighters. It wants stability. It wants the guy who doesn't break the table when he loses a card game. So when the war broke out, China chose to be the quiet friend, because quiet friends often get trusted more in the long run. 6. Backing off is not giving up. It's positioning in business. You never make your move when the market is on fire. You wait. You listen. You invest when others run. China backed off not because it gave up on Iran or because it supported Israel. It backed off because it was thinking beyond the war. Tomorrow's winner is not the one who dropped the most bombs. It's the one everyone wants to sit down with when the war ends. So, my friends, when you see a giant step back, don't always assume it's retreat. Sometimes it's a leap being prepared. Remember, you don't win wars by joining them. You win by outlasting them. Thank you. Let me know if you want this speech adapted for TV, a panel discussion, a YouTube vlog, or to add region-specific references like Pakistan, the Belt and Road, etc. When we talk about global conflict, particularly something as charged as the Iran-Israel war, the world expects immediate reactions. Cameras point to capitals. Analysts speculate, social media flares up. And yet China, the second largest economy in the world, a global power, and a strategic partner to both Iran and Israel in different capacities, stayed silent. People asked, why didn't China speak up when it mattered most? But perhaps, in that very silence we find the answer. Timing is everything, but so is silence. In business, when you're negotiating a billion-dollar deal, the loudest person in the room is rarely the smartest. The one who listens more, speaks less, watches the emotional temperature rise and fall, and waits for others to reveal too much. That's the one who often walks away with the best deal. Politics, diplomacy, and international conflict operate under similar dynamics. China's silence during the Iran-Israel war wasn't because it didn't know what to say. It's because it knew there was more to gain by saying less. Most people confuse action with reaction. When there's a fire, the instinct is to throw water or at least to run toward it. But that's not strategy. That's emotion. Strategy is asking, where did the fire start? Who benefits from it? What happens after the flames are out? China has learned through thousands of years of history that jumping into a war, especially one that doesn't directly threaten your borders, is not only unwise but also potentially self-destructive. By staying quiet, it created room to observe, to negotiate in the shadows, to keep doors open on all sides while others close theirs out of emotion or ideology. Silence in international affairs is not absence, it's positioning. The louder other nations became, pledging full support to one side or condemning the other, the more room China gained to act as a potential stabilizer later. When a country speaks loudly and takes a hard stance, it reduces its flexibility. It limits future options. But silence preserves optionality. In a world that's changing minute by minute, that's a powerful thing to have. Think of it like playing poker. You don't show your hand until you have to. The minute you start reacting to every card on the table, you've already lost the game. Timing, too, is a subtle but decisive force. Say something too early, and you're forced to defend it later. Say something too late, and you lose relevance. But say something at just the right moment, when all ears are open, when the chaos has slowed just enough for people to want solutions. Then even a whisper can sound like thunder. China is not in a hurry. It plays a long game. It knows that global narratives shift. Today's hero can be tomorrow's villain. Today's villain may be tomorrow's partner in reconstruction. So why lock yourself into a label too early? The world is used to Western-style diplomacy, bold statements, press conferences, military movements, sanctions. But China's approach is more nuanced, less visible, more economic than ideological. It believes in letting others expend their energy first. Just like in martial arts, you don't strike first. You wait for your opponent to make a move, show their rhythm, expose their weakness. Then you act, not with brute force, but with timing and precision. The Iran-Israel war was a stage where many players rushed to the front. China, instead, chose to study the script from behind the curtain. In times of chaos, silence can look like indecision. But often, it's the opposite. It's a disciplined choice. The choice to wait, to watch, to calculate. Because when the noise dies down, the ones who didn't shout are the ones people finally want to hear from. In the West, strategy is often taught through the game of chess. Aggressive, fast, and built around sacrifice and dominance. You move a piece, take a piece, risk a piece, always hunting for the king. It's direct, dramatic, and zero-sum. One wins, the other loses. But in the East, especially in Chinese thinking, the game of Go teaches something else entirely. Go is not about attacking head-on. It's about influence, space balance. You don't try to defeat your opponent in one bold move. You quietly expand, surround, adapt, and over time, you shape the entire board. That's how China approaches foreign policy. And that's why, during the Iran-Israel war, it didn't rush to pick a side or raise its voice. It was playing Go, not chess. When a war breaks out, many nations treat it like a game of speed. Get ahead of the news cycle. Issue a statement. Show strength. But strength is not always shown in volume. Sometimes true strength is the ability to restrain yourself when everyone else is reacting emotionally. While others were busy moving their pieces into battle positions, China kept its stones on the board untouched. Not because it didn't care, but because it was thinking 10 moves ahead. You don't sacrifice a stone in Go unless it secures you territory later. Every move has a cost, and in the Middle East, the cost of even a sentence can be massive. China has economic interests in both Iran and Israel. It's built pipelines, signed long-term trade agreements, and invested in infrastructure. In this context, taking sides too early would be like building a house on one side of a river during a flood. You might look loyal, but later, when the water recedes, you're stuck on the wrong bank. China's choice to stay in the middle, or rather, to appear to stay out of it, was not an absence of strategy. It was the strategy. In Go, it's common to let your opponent claim a small victory in one corner if it means gaining influence over the rest of the board. This kind of thinking frustrates those who expect immediate declarations and bold gestures. But in a game where time is your ally, patience becomes power. China doesn't see a war as a single crisis. It sees it as part of a broader pattern, an opportunity to observe global reactions, test alliances, and quietly adjust its own long-term positioning. This is why you didn't see an aggressive diplomatic or military move from Beijing during the conflict. While Western powers were vocal and reactive, China's power play was its stillness. That's not to say it wasn't active. In fact, it was probably making dozens of quiet calls behind the scenes, watching oil prices, evaluating shipping routes, gauging the response from Arab nations, Europe, and the US. It was working, just not in the way people expected. It was making sure its presence wasn't in headlines, but was felt in boardrooms and corridors where real influence lives. Playing Go means accepting that short-term clarity is not always possible. Sometimes the board looks chaotic, confusing, but over time, as patterns emerge, you see the brilliance in moves that look passive at first. That's how China thinks. It's not interested in winning today's argument. It's interested in owning tomorrow's map. When you act too soon, you give away your intent. When you speak too loudly, you give away your position. China knows that in a world that's watching, your silence often echoes louder than your words. The Iran-Israel war, for many, was a test of loyalty, morality, and leadership. But for China, it was a test of foresight, leverage, and patience. It wasn't a moment to take a side. It was a moment to expand quiet influence across the region without triggering alarms. When others played chess, looking for a quick checkmate, China simply placed another stone on the board, confident that the real game is still unfolding. When people think of war, they often imagine guns, tanks, and missiles. They think of generals planning strikes and soldiers marching across borders. But in the modern world, wars are no longer won solely by the military. The real victories and losses happen in the realm of economics. Money moves faster than armies. Sanctions can do more damage than bombs. A disrupted supply chain can collapse a government more efficiently than an invasion. This is the lens through which China sees the Iran-Israel war. It doesn't just ask who is winning on the battlefield, it asks who is bleeding financially, who controls the energy routes, who is losing investor confidence, and who will be left with the bill when the smoke clears. China's economy thrives on connectivity. Trade, logistics, infrastructure, digital finance, these are the tools of its modern empire. When war breaks out in the Middle East, a region central to oil supply and global shipping, the impact is felt not just in Tehran or Tel Aviv, but in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. Every missile launch shakes the oil markets. Every headline raises insurance costs on cargo routes. And so, China's primary concern is not about ideology, it's about stability. Because in today's world, economic disruptions ripple across borders faster than military alliances can respond. While the world watched the battlefield, China watched the market. Oil prices surged, currencies fluctuated, investors hesitated. For a country that imports over 70% of its oil and runs one of the most complex manufacturing systems on Earth, these aren't side effects, they are core threats. Supporting one side in the conflict, especially with public declarations or visible military aid, would have triggered immediate economic retaliation or isolation. It would have risked its trade agreements with Western nations, jeopardized investments in Middle Eastern infrastructure, and possibly derailed long-term projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. For China, economic continuity is not just policy, it's survival. Another layer to this is the financial relationships China has built with both Iran and Israel. Iran is a key supplier of energy and a major component in the broader Central Asia strategy. At the same time, Israel is a hub for technology, innovation, and military hardware, all of which China studies closely. The war put these two partners in direct conflict. Publicly choosing one would mean financially abandoning the other. That's not just political risk. It's billions of dollars in trade, infrastructure, and long-term cooperation evaporating overnight. Rather than sacrificing that for momentary geopolitical applause, China chose to protect its economic interests. It chose to focus on securing energy routes, ensuring maritime stability, and calming market fears. It worked behind the scenes to avoid sanctions. It maintained relationships with both sides, keeping future trade and diplomacy on the table. Because at the end of the day, when the war ends, roads must be rebuilt, systems must be restored, economies must be restarted. And the one who didn't burn bridges during the war will be the first to build them after. China understands that wars end, but economic wounds remain. They scar nations for decades. Public debt rises, currencies collapse, industries vanish. It also knows that modern wars are expensive for everyone involved, even the spectators. Global inflation doesn't care which side you supported. Disrupted supply chains don't recognize military borders. And investors, whether in Frankfurt, New York, or Dubai, all look to the same signals: risk, stability, confidence. China knows its global position depends not on how loud it speaks during war, but on how steady it appears when there is a principle in both business and strategy that many people ignore: never risk your core assets for someone else's battle. When a neighbor's house is on fire, your instinct might be to help, to rush in, to show solidarity. But if you're wearing your best suit, holding your life's work in your arms, and your own house is made of dry wood, then jumping into the blaze may not be noble, it may be foolish. This is how China viewed the Iran-Israel war. It wasn't just about morality, loyalty, or global image. It was about protecting the factory, the economy, the machinery that powers its growth, while the world turned into a theater of crisis. China's current internal situation is far from calm. Its real estate sector is in distress, with massive developers defaulting and millions of homes unoccupied. Youth unemployment is rising, consumption is slowing, and local governments are strained under growing debt. These are not surface-level concerns. These are systemic challenges that require stability, careful planning, and intense focus. Engaging in a foreign conflict, especially one that has the potential to spiral into a regional or even global war, would be a direct contradiction to that focus. It would be like setting down the blueprint for a power plant to go chase smoke in someone else's backyard. Foreign policy is often portrayed as a game of dominance, influence, and symbolism. But for China, it is more a question of preservation, preserving energy security, supply chains, investor confidence, and domestic harmony. The Middle East, while strategically important, is also unpredictable. Aligning too strongly with either Iran or Israel would not only complicate diplomatic ties, but risk dragging China into the deep emotional and historical rivalries of a region that has long defied clean alliances. In such an environment, staying neutral is not an absence of opinion. It is a calculated form of risk management. When a business scales to a global level, it faces a dilemma. How much should it get involved in the problems of others without endangering its own systems? A wise CEO understands that distractions, even when they appear noble or urgent, can destroy the very foundation of what's been built. China's global role is not just as a consumer or producer, but as a central hub in the modern economic ecosystem. If that hub is destabilized by sanctions, military entanglements, or reputational damage, then it is not just China that suffers. Every country tied to its supply chains, every region that depends on its investments, every company with contracts in Asia feels that shock. This is why, despite having strategic interests in the Middle East, China chose restraint, not because it lacks ambition, but because it understands cost. In business, not every opportunity is worth pursuing. Timing matters. So does capacity. If your internal machinery is overheated, even a small external shock can cause a system failure. China's priority right now is restoring economic momentum, not engaging in ideological warfare. Its citizens want jobs, housing, healthcare, and stability, not another televised war that drains resources and fuels inflation. There's also a deeper principle at play: the difference between influence and interference. Influence is earned over time through trade, cooperation, and cultural respect. Interference, on the other hand, creates enemies, suspicion, and backlash. By not throwing its weight around in the Iran-Israel conflict, China preserved its image as a non-imperial power, something it carefully markets to the global south. In a world tired of interventions that leave nations broken, China is positioning itself as the builder, not the bomber, risking that identity for a war it didn't start, doesn't control, and won't benefit directly from would have undermined years of diplomatic investment. More importantly, it would have weakened its internal resilience at a time when every resource is needed to stabilize the home front. In international politics, just like in business, your allies can become liabilities if they're too loud at the wrong time. The global market doesn't reward emotional outbursts or public displays of loyalty when they come at the cost of stability. In fact, global investors, trade partners, and financial institutions all look for one thing above all else: predictability. They don't care which side you support if your support causes chaos. And that's where China made its calculation during the Iran-Israel war. It didn't back off because it lacked principles. It backed off because it understood that loud friends can cost you silent profits. Global markets do not have a political ideology. They react to uncertainty, not morality. Every statement of support, every military movement, every shift in alliance sends signals to traders, insurers, and governments. A misinterpreted headline can wipe out billions in a single hour. China is deeply connected to this reality. With its currency still finding footing in global reserves, with its tech firms under scrutiny, and with its energy supplies dependent on global goodwill, it knows that every move it makes has consequences far beyond the immediate. When others raise their voices in conflict, China listens more closely to what the markets are saying. And what the markets want is not righteousness, they want calm. During the war, many countries rushed to take positions. Some sent weapons, others sent statements. But each of these choices had a price. China looked at that price and asked a simple question: is it worth it? Supporting Iran too strongly could isolate it from Western markets. Supporting Israel too loudly could ruin its long-term credibility in the Muslim world. Neither path offered a clean economic advantage. But what was clear was that both paths were loud, and being loud in the middle of a global firestorm can make even your closest partners nervous. In times of peace, loud friends can be valuable. They defend you, elevate your voice, and push your agenda. But in times of war, especially when you're trying to grow your influence quietly across regions, a loud friend becomes a spotlight. Suddenly, your networks are scrutinized, your supply chains are questioned, your intentions are debated in global forums. For China, this was not the moment to stand next to someone with a megaphone. It was the moment to remain just out of the camera frame, still speaking, still watching, still moving, but without drawing unnecessary attention. China's economy depends on perception. Not just the perception of its strength, but the perception of its reliability. Investors must believe that China won't suddenly become a battlefield. African governments working on infrastructure deals must believe China won't abandon them for a regional military campaign. Southeast Asian partners watching the South China Sea must believe that Beijing is focused on trade, not conflict. Every perception that China has worked to build over the past decade, as a development partner, as a trade leader, as a stable negotiator, could unravel if it attached itself too publicly to a divisive conflict. It understood that while loyalty may win you applause in the short term, discretion builds trust over time. China also knows that neutrality, when executed correctly, creates opportunity. When the war ends, someone will have to broker deals. Someone will have to fund reconstruction. Someone will need to reopen supply lines and renegotiate energy flows. The countries that stayed too close to one side may no longer be welcome in the other's camp. But those who stayed in the middle, kept their voice measured, and avoided the noise, those are the ones both sides will call first. China isn't just avoiding risk. It's positioning itself as the first number dialed when peace becomes more profitable than war. Backing off is often misunderstood. People think it's about surrender, weakness, or fear. But in high-stakes strategy, backing off is sometimes the most intelligent move on the board. It's not about giving up. It's about knowing when to stop pushing and when to start positioning. China didn't loudly take a side in the Iran-Israel war because it wasn't looking to win that specific battle. It was looking to win something bigger: influence, leverage, trust. And none of those things come from joining a war at the peak of its chaos. They come from being the one that others turn to when the chaos ends. Most people are trained to think in moments. What's happening today? Who's winning now? But real strategy isn't about moments. It's about patterns. China doesn't view this war as an isolated crisis. It sees it as one chapter in a long book of shifting power balances, global distrust, and economic restructuring. It knows that jumping into this war could close doors in the future. So instead, it kept its doors slightly open to all sides. That's not indecision. That's positioning. Being quiet during a war means you're available to speak when people start listening again. Being neutral now means you can become useful later. When countries pick sides loudly, they create memory, not just in governments but in populations. People remember who supported their enemy, and those memories don't fade with the news cycle. They stay. They shape elections, policies, trade decisions. So China's calculation was long-term. Don't make enemies where you might need partners. Don't say something today that will prevent a deal 5 years from now. Every statement is a record. Every move is a signal. The fewer you make during crisis, the more moves you have available when everyone else is stuck in their own rhetoric. This is also about rhythm. In negotiation, in diplomacy, in business, you don't always speak first. Sometimes, you let others talk themselves into a corner. You let them show their limits, exhaust their energy, burn their options. Then, when the room quiets down, you enter. And you enter not with noise, but with solutions. China doesn't want to be the loudest voice in the room. It wants to be the one that brings people back to the table when the shouting ends. That requires patience, confidence, and an understanding that being early isn't always being right. By backing off during the Iran-Israel war, China didn't exit the stage. It just stepped behind the curtain watching, calculating, making calls that aren't in the headlines, because that's where real power grows, in spaces not yet public. It's the same in business. Some of the biggest deals don't happen at press conferences. They happen in quiet rooms, months before anyone sees the result. China is preparing for those rooms. While others are busy making declarations, China is making openings. When the war ends, and every war ends, the region will need trade, energy, infrastructure, reconstruction, and political mediation. Not just between Iran and Israel, but between their allies, their trading partners, their divided populations. Who steps in then? The ones who stayed clean. The ones who didn't bomb, accuse, or shame. The ones who didn't put their flag over someone else's pain. That's where China wants to be. Not in the headlines of war, but in the footnotes of peace agreements, infrastructure contracts, and new trade deals. Backing off wasn't the end of involvement. It was the beginning of strategic patience. The world often respects strength, but it rewards usefulness. The country that brings calm when there's tension, money when there's damage, and solutions when there's fatigue becomes indispensable. That's what China is aiming for. Not dominance in the moment, but relevance over time. It knows that being present when everyone else is burned out is more valuable than being loud when the fire is still raging. In a world driven by constant reaction, it's easy to believe that doing something is always better than doing nothing. That silence means absence, or neutrality means weakness. But in reality, strategic patience is one of the hardest things to master. Most people act to feel in control, even if their actions create more problems. But some understand that control isn't always about what you do. It's about what you resist doing. During the Iran-Israel war, when pressure mounted and the world watched closely, China chose restraint, not because it had no role to play, but because it understood that positioning for what comes after the war is far more powerful than trying to win attention during it. The global system doesn't just operate on diplomacy or military decisions. It runs on timing. And timing is a currency that loses value the moment it's wasted. When a storm is at its peak, when everyone is panicking, when alliances are being tested and emotions are high, any move becomes risky. What you say may be misunderstood. What you do may have ripple effects you can't reverse. This is not the right time to act boldly. It's the right time to observe deeply. China's decision to stay low, key during the conflict, was not about passivity. It was about timing its relevance. Opportunities aren't just about what exists. They're about when they become accessible. The end of a war creates gaps. New needs arise. Trust must be rebuilt. Systems have to be put back together. That is when countries, companies, and institutions start looking around for dependable partners. The ones they trust are rarely those who were loudest during the fighting. It's those who stayed balanced, who didn't overcommit, who didn't burn bridges. China is betting on that moment. It's positioning itself to step in when others are exhausted and the region needs rebuilding, not rhetoric. There's a concept in investing: don't catch a falling knife. If a stock is crashing, you don't rush in just because it looks cheap. You wait for it to stabilize. You wait for the panic to slow. Because even the best company becomes dangerous when you enter at the wrong time. The same logic applies to geopolitics. The Middle East has always been a volatile investment, rich in opportunity but also in complexity. Entering at the height of violence isn't bold, it's reckless. China's decision to stay quiet wasn't a lack of courage. It was the discipline not to catch the knife midair. It also comes down to understanding leverage. When you don't get pulled into a conflict emotionally, you keep your full range of tools intact. Economic influence, diplomatic channels, trade agreements, long-term infrastructure plans. These remain usable only when you don't compromise them for short-term symbolism. Many of the countries that took bold stances during the war may later find it difficult to work with the side they opposed. China avoided that trap. It kept itself available to everyone, not by being vague but by being strategic. In negotiations, leverage often comes from being needed. And to be needed, you must remain credible to all sides. This is especially true in regions like the Middle East, where alliances shift, regimes change, and public opinion can flip overnight. By staying relatively silent, China preserved a unique kind of credibility, the ability to engage both sides without appearing compromised. It's not easy to do, and very few powers can manage it, but it creates space for long-term influence. Every action you take today limits your options tomorrow. That's the reality of high-level strategy. China didn't want to spend all its influence during the war. It wanted to save it for the aftermath, when the world will be desperate not for declarations, but for delivery. The country that shows up then, with resources, infrastructure, and financing, will shape not just the peace, but the memory of the war itself. When a crisis erupts, most people look at the center of the explosion. They look at the fire, the noise, the headlines. But influence doesn't come from standing in the fire. It comes from shaping what happens around it. Power is not always at the front of the stage. Sometimes it's backstage, managing the spotlight, adjusting the timing, deciding when the curtains rise and fall. In the Iran-Israel war, the world expected a reaction from China. A clear stance, a public move, a line drawn. But what it got instead was quiet calculation, subtle diplomacy, and controlled presence. Because China wasn't focused on the flames, it was studying the wind. Modern geopolitics isn't about territory as much as it is about flow. Flow of energy, data, capital, and trust. Wars disrupt those flows. They create panic, disorder, unpredictability. And in that unpredictability, there is opportunity, but only for those who are calm enough to see it. China didn't jump into the conflict because it saw the value of being the constant in a time when everything else was shaking. When others were losing control, China maintained it. When others were reacting, China was recording. In a crisis, the observer often ends up more powerful than the participants. You don't build trust in the middle of noise. You build it in the quiet spaces between events. While countries aligned themselves loudly with one side or the other, China chose to stay close to its long-term strategy. It knows that credibility isn't created by bold statements during war. Credibility is earned over decades of consistency. Countries don't rely on you because you agree with them in conflict. They rely on you because you were steady when others were not. That steadiness becomes a kind of currency, one that pays off when people start looking for solutions instead of slogans. Every war eventually runs out of fuel. People get tired. Economies slow. Governments change. But after the war ends, the real work begins. Infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. Trade routes need to reopen. Technology needs to flow. Partnerships need to be revived. In that moment, every country looks for one thing: someone who didn't pick a fight. Someone who still has all doors open. Someone who can talk to everyone. That someone becomes the broker of peace, the builder of bridges, the architect of the new order. And to be that, you must be present but not overexposed. In the case of the Iran-Israel conflict, China preserved its access. It didn't damage its trade with either side. It didn't burn credibility in the Muslim world, nor did it alienate Western observers. It stayed in a space where it could be approached by all, trusted by some, and tolerated by many. That space is not easy to maintain. It requires restraint, foresight, and the ability to absorb criticism without reacting. But it is a space that pays off when others are no longer able to move. When the game resets, those who moved least often move first. There's also a psychological layer. When everyone is shouting, the quietest voice becomes the most intriguing. It forces others to lean in, to wonder, to guess. That guessing creates curiosity, and curiosity gives you power. China's silence during the war wasn't an absence of message. It was a strategy to make others pay attention when it finally does speak. That moment will come not during peak conflict, but during the transition out of it. And when it speaks, it won't be about sides. It will be about solutions. Power today is not about dominance. It's about relevance. You stay relevant by making yourself useful, not loud. China is not trying to be the hero of the conflict. It's trying to be the partner of the aftermath. When missiles stop and markets reopen, when diplomats return to tables, and when reconstruction plans begin, the most valuable player will not be the one who won the argument. It will be the one who still has something left to offer.